Surprise, Nebraska, December 1889. While his neighbors rushed to seal their cabins against the coming winter with standard single-pane windows, Frederick Straub was still building in his workshop. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Instead of trusting one layer of glass like everyone else, he spent weeks crafting a second wooden frame with its own pane, a storm sash that he nailed directly over the outside of his existing window. He left exactly 1 inch of dead air between the two pieces of glass. Other settlers finished their window preparations in an afternoon. Straub took a month perfecting his double-layer system. The storekeeper laughed and said 2 windows won't make you see twice. Then February 1899 arrived. The great Arctic outbreak slammed the plains, with temperatures dropping to 20 below zero and colder. Standard single-pane windows frosted solid, blocking light and bleeding heat all night. Neighbors burned furniture to survive while their cabins turned into ice boxes. But Straub's cabin, with its double glass. At 2 in the morning, his thermometer read 52 degrees while his neighbor's identical cabin registered 25 degrees. A difference of 27 degrees warmer. What did this Nebraska carpenter understand about trapping air and stopping heat loss that every other homesteader completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Night wind clawed at the one-room cabin in Surprise, Nebraska, carrying the promise of harder cold to come. Frederick Straub held a second wooden frame up to his window casing, checking the fit one more time before reaching for his hammer. Outside, the December air hung at 15 below zero and falling. His neighbors watched from across the frozen yard like he was boarding up light itself. He positioned the storm sash carefully against the exterior window trim, ensuring the 1-inch gap he had measured so precisely would remain undisturbed. The frame itself was simple enough, straight cottonwood rails and stiles, 7/8 of an inch thick and 2 inches wide, joined with pegged half-laps that would hold tight through prairie winds. The glass pane, set in putty and pinned with glazing points, caught the last gray light of the December afternoon. 8 finishing nails would secure it to the casing, with wooden turn buttons providing additional hold against the weather. "Glass costs money," called out the storekeeper from his position near the fence line. He had walked over with 2 other men when word spread that Straub was at it again, building something nobody asked for and nobody understood. "You're doubling your window investment for what?" Straub drove the first nail home with 3 measured strikes. The sound carried sharp and clean in the cold. Air. "Drafts come from cracks, not from glass," added the quick builder who had thrown up his own cabin in 3 weeks that fall. "If the window frosts, wipe it." The criticism rolled off Straub like wind off a shed roof. He had spent too many mornings watching inside frost turn his neighbors' windows into white bricks, blocking light and bleeding heat all through the bitter nights. Glass conducted heat faster than wood, and when interior moisture hit that cold surface, ice formed thick enough to scrape with a knife. The result was a window that might as well have been boarded shut, except that it kept stealing warmth from the room. Butler County winters were honest. They told you exactly where your preparations failed. Timber was precious here, hauled from distant mills or cut from creek bottoms where cottonwoods grew sparse and crooked. Every board cost labor or cash, and waste meant cold. But Straub had calculated differently than his neighbors. He had seen what happened when single-pane windows met plains cold, and he trusted his hands more than conventional wisdom. The storm sash measured 14 inches by 20 inches, sized to match the rough opening of his existing window. The dead air space between the 2 panes would do the work, not magic, just physics slowed down to human speed. Air moved heat, but trapped air moved it slowly. The outer pane would take the wind and the worst cold, while the inner pane stayed warmer, reducing the frost and cutting the radiant chill that made sitting near a window feel like leaning toward an ice house. "2 windows won't make you see twice," the storekeeper said, shaking his head as Straub positioned the final turn button. The other men chuckled, their breath forming white clouds that the wind scattered immediately. Straub hung a thermometer at chest height, about 4 feet from the floor, and marked the wall with pencil lines to ensure consistent placement. He had done the same thing in his neighbor's cabin 3 days earlier, establishing identical measurement points 6 feet from the stove and 1 foot from the window. Science required consistency, and frontier survival demanded proof. The self-taught carpenter who had appointed himself the settlement's building authority stepped closer to examine the installation. "You're sealing yourself in with all that putty and tight fit," he observed. "House needs to breathe." "House needs to stay warm," Straub replied, checking the perimeter seal one more time. The storm sash sat snug against the exterior casing, with no gaps for wind to exploit. The glazing putty had been worked smooth and painted to shed water. Every detail served the same purpose, keeping the dead air space undisturbed and stopping heat loss at its source. The temperature was still dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. Straub could feel it in the way the wind cut differently, sharper, and more persistent. The weather signs all pointed toward a hard night, the kind that separated adequate preparation from wishful thinking. His neighbors would load their stoves heavy and bank the coals, burning through cordwood at a rate that made every split log precious. They would wake to frosted windows and cold floors, wondering why their fires worked so hard for so little warmth. But Straub had changed the equation. The outer pane would ice over when the cold deepened, but the inner pane would stay clearer, warmer to the touch, and less likely to radiate that bone-deep chill that made frontier winters feel endless. The air gap between them would slow the heat loss enough to make a measurable difference, not in theory, but in degrees that a man could feel and a thermometer could prove. "By morning, I'll be at least 20 degrees warmer than you," he said to the assembled critics, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had done his calculations. "Likely more." The storekeeper laughed and turned back toward town, the others following. They had seen enough of Straub's peculiar methods to dismiss this latest project as another waste of time and materials. Winter would teach them all the same lessons it always did, and spring would separate the survivors from the unfortunate. They trusted the tried methods: single-pane windows, tight chinking, and plenty of fuel for the stove. What more could a man do against plains cold? Straub gathered his tools as full darkness settled over Butler County. Inside his cabin, the oil lamp cast steady light through both panes of glass, the storm sash already proving its first benefit. Tomorrow would bring colder air, and the real test would come when the thermometer told its unforgiving story. Until then, he had work to finish and a fire to tend, secure in the knowledge that his preparation would speak louder than his neighbor's laughter. The first serious cold snap arrived 3 weeks later, dropping Butler County into the teens below zero overnight. By dawn, the difference between Straub's preparation and conventional wisdom had written itself in frost patterns across every window in surprise. In neighboring cabins, ice feathered across single-pane glass in delicate, beautiful formations that blocked light completely. The windows had become opaque white barriers, transforming homes into caves lit only by firelight and oil lamps. Straub walked the settlement that morning, observing what winter had taught in a single night. At the quick builder's cabin, frost covered the interior glass so thick it could be scraped with a knife blade. The man's wife held a lamp close to the window, trying to peer through a small, clear spot near the bottom corner where her breath had melted the ice temporarily. The stove worked harder than usual, burning through split wood at a rate that made every cord precious, yet the room still carried that peculiar chill that seemed to settle around the windows and creep along the floor. The physics were writing themselves across the settlement in ways anyone could read. Upper Little Tennessee River Basin, autumn of 1763. While neighboring Cherokee families quickly dug standard open hearth pits for the approaching winter, hunter and craftsman Kea Tali was still working in his 8th week of preparation, coating his below-ground fire pit with a thick layer of white clay mixed with crushed mussel shells. His fellow townspeople called it clay crazy. The tribal elders questioned why he wasted time on potter's work when simple mud-lined pits had heated winter houses for generations. Then the brutal freeze of 1763 arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 8 degrees below zero and stayed there for 39 consecutive days. the harshest cold in living memory that would test every heating method in the middle towns. Standard open hearths consumed double their expected wood, while house interiors still dropped below freezing. Families woke to frost-covered blankets and spoiled food stores. But Kayatali's clay-coated fire pit radiated steady heat through the night, keeping his house warm with 70% less fuel while others burned through their winter wood supplies. What did this Cherokee craftsman understand about thermal mass and heat retention that even modern fireplaces fail to achieve? The morning mist clung to the Little Tennessee River as Kayatali knelt beside the circular hole he had been excavating behind his winter house for the past 3 weeks. At 38, he possessed the steady hands of a skilled woodworker and the methodical patience that had served him well as both hunter and seasonal trader with the Creek settlements to the south. But this autumn project had drawn more attention than he preferred from his neighbors in the Middletown's region. His brother Chano crouched beside the pit, measuring its depth with a marked hickory staff. 3 feet exactly, the 22-year-old confirmed, his breath visible in the crisp October air. The circular excavation stretched 4 feet across, its walls carved straight and true through the red clay soil that characterized this section of the Appalachian foothills. Chano had spent the previous day helping haul out basket loads of earth, though he still questioned the logic behind his older brother's design. "The smoke will settle in such a deep pit," Chano said, echoing concerns he had heard from other young men in the settlement. "Uncle Taliga says the fire needs to breathe upward, not hide underground like a root cellar." Kayatali continued smoothing the pit walls with a flat stone scraper, his movements deliberate and practiced. The memory of the winter of 1757 still burned clearly in his mind, the season when his father's standard hearth had failed to keep their house above freezing, when their stored squash had turned to mush and ice crystals had formed on the interior walls, despite burning wood every 2 hours through the night. That winter had taught him that accepted methods, to accept that his 3-week construction schedule might have overlooked something important. Straub answered the skepticism with standardization. He proposed a controlled comparison that would eliminate variables and settle the question definitively. Same wood species and loading schedule for both stoves. Thermometers placed at identical heights and distances from heat sources. Measurements taken at the same times throughout a cold night. The teacher agreed to serve as an independent observer, recording readings every 2 hours from sunset to sunrise. The test cabin belonged to a neighbor whose construction methods matched the quick builder's approach exactly: single-pane windows, standard chinking, and a corner fireplace built from local stone. The two structures sat less than 100 yards apart, facing the same prevailing wind and built from timber cut in the same creek bottom. The only significant difference was Straub's storm sash installation, which created a perfect laboratory for measuring the impact of double glazing on interior comfort. They established measurement points at 4 feet height, 6 feet from the stove, and 1 foot from the window to capture both general room temperature and the specific cold zone that developed near single-pane glass. The thermometers were positioned identically in both cabins, with pencil marks on the walls, ensuring consistent placement throughout the night. As evening approached and the temperature began dropping toward another night in the teens below zero, both men loaded their stoves with identical splits of seasoned oak. The fires were built to the same intensity, with dampers adjusted to maintain steady heat output through the long winter night. Every variable that could be controlled had been eliminated, leaving only the storm sash to account for any temperature differences that might develop. The teacher arrived with her notebook and watch, prepared to document what might become the settlement's definitive answer to the question of whether extra glass justified extra expense. The stakes had grown beyond simple comfort. Cordwood supplies were finite, and any technique that stretched fuel efficiency through the hardest months could mean the difference between adequate heat and dangerous cold before spring returned to Butler County. Outside, the wind began picking up as full darkness settled over the Nebraska plains, carrying the promise of another night that would test every cabin's preparation against the honest judgment of frontier winter. February 1899 brought the kind of cold that rewrote the rules of plains survival. The great Arctic outbreak slammed into Nebraska with temperatures that made previous winters seem mild by comparison. Weather stations across the region recorded readings of 20 below zero and colder, with some areas dropping even further as polar air settled over the continent like a crushing weight. In Butler County, the mercury disappeared into ranges that made breathing painful and exposed skin dangerous within minutes. The crisis arrived without the gradual buildup that allowed for additional preparation. One day brought typical winter cold, and the next morning revealed a landscape transformed into something barely habitable. The wind carried a different quality now, sharp enough to cut through wool and leather, persistent enough to find every gap in construction that had seemed adequate during milder weather. Smoke from cabin chimneys rose straight up in the still air before the wind caught it and drove it horizontal across the frozen prairie. Inside the settlement's cabins, the failure of normal methods became immediately apparent. Windows that had shown manageable frost during previous cold snaps now developed ice layers thick enough to block light completely by midnight. The single-pane glass conducted heat so efficiently that interior surfaces dropped below freezing, creating conditions inside that rivaled the outdoors in their hostility to human comfort. Families found themselves burning furniture to maintain adequate heat, their carefully hoarded cordwood supplies proving insufficient against the extraordinary cold. The quick builder's cabin became a laboratory of inadequate preparation. Despite running his stove at maximum output, loading it with seasoned oak every 2 hours through the night, the interior temperature collapsed after dark when the wind rose and the cold deepened. The single-pane windows turned into heat sinks that drained warmth from the room faster than the fire could replace it. By 2 a.m, with the stove glowing red and consuming wood at an unsustainable rate, his thermometer registered 25 degrees at chest height, 6 feet from the fire. Airflow around the leaky sash frames created indoor weather patterns that made the cabin nearly uninhabitable. Cold air seeped through gaps in the window installation, creating drafts that moved along the floor and up the walls, carrying heat away from the fire and delivering it to the exterior through every available path. The man's wife wrapped herself in quilts and blankets, but the radiant cold from the frosted windows made it impossible to stay comfortable even within a few feet of the fire. Similar scenes played out in cabins throughout the settlement as the Great Arctic outbreak tested every aspect of frontier construction. Men who had dismissed careful preparation as overcautious found themselves facing conditions that made survival a moment-by-moment calculation. Families huddled together around their fires, burning through winter fuel supplies at rates that threatened to leave them without adequate heat for the remainder of the cold season. But Straub's cabin told a different story entirely. The storm sash system he had installed against his neighbor's advice proved its worth during the very conditions that exposed the inadequacy of conventional methods. The outer pane bore the full assault of the polar air, developing the same thick frost that plagued every other window in the settlement. However, the trapped airspace between the two pieces of glass slowed heat transfer enough to maintain fundamentally different conditions inside. At 2 a.m, when the quick builder's thermometer showed 25 degrees despite maximum fire output, Straub's identical measurement point registered 52 degrees. The difference was precise, measurable, and dramatic, 27 degrees warmer under identical fuel consumption and loading schedules. The county teacher, maintaining her vigil as an independent observer, recorded the readings with the methodical precision that made her documentation valuable evidence rather than partisan claims. The physics of the storm sash became visible during the extreme cold in ways that earlier tests had only suggested. The inner pane remained clear enough to allow light passage, while the outer pane bore all the ice formation that would normally occur on a single-pane installation. More importantly, the interior glass surface stayed warm enough to prevent the radiant cold effect that made sitting near conventional windows feel like facing an open door. The dead air space, maintained at exactly 1 inch through careful installation, performed its work of slowing heat conduction with mechanical reliability that matched Straub's calculations. The fuel efficiency advantage became equally apparent as the night progressed. Where the quick builder required constant feeding of his fire to maintain even marginal warmth, Straub's cabin retained heat with far less wood consumption. The storm sash reduced the heat loss that made conventional cabins work so hard against extreme cold, allowing the same fire to warm the space more effectively and maintain comfortable temperatures with standard loading schedules, rather than the desperate overfeeding that characterized other homes during the outbreak. By dawn, when the temperature had spent 6 hours below 20 degrees and showed no signs of moderating, the difference between adequate preparation and wishful thinking had written itself in thermometer readings that no argument could dismiss. The quick builder's cabin had become barely habitable despite maximum effort and unsustainable fuel consumption. His family had spent the night huddled around the fire, wrapped in every available blanket, while frost continued forming on interior surfaces throughout the room. Straub's family had slept in normal bedding, awakening to a cabin warm enough for routine morning activities. The fire had burned steadily through the night without requiring the constant attention that kept other families awake and worried about fuel supplies. The storm sash had proven its value under the exact conditions that mattered most, extreme cold that turned minor construction differences into major survival advantages. The Great Arctic outbreak continued for 3 more days, maintaining temperatures that challenged every aspect of frontier life. But the fundamental question raised by Straub's unconventional preparation had been answered with the precision that only crisis could provide. 27 degrees warmer was not a marginal improvement. It was the difference between dangerous cold and livable warmth, between burning furniture and maintaining reasonable fuel consumption, between surviving winter and facing it with confidence. Before dawn on the 4th day of the Great Arctic outbreak, a soft knock came at Straub's door. The quick builder stood outside, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter and more desperate. He did not ask for theory or explanations. He did not acknowledge his earlier dismissals or defend his construction methods. He simply said, "Can you show me how?" Straub opened his door wider, letting the man into warmth that felt miraculous after 3 nights of barely survivable cold. The quick builder's hands were stiff with cold, despite heavy mittens, and his face carried the drawn look of someone who had spent too many hours feeding a fire that could not keep up with heat loss. Behind him, smoke rose from chimneys throughout the settlement as families burned through their remaining furniture and fence posts, having exhausted their cordwood supplies, maintaining minimal warmth. Within an hour, 2 more men had arrived at Straub's door with similar requests. The storekeeper came next, followed by the self-appointed carpenter who had criticized the storm sash installation as excessive. None of them came with apologies or admissions of error. They came with the practical desperation of men who had learned that survival mattered more than pride, and that 27 degrees of additional warmth was worth whatever materials and labor it required. Straub sheltered the most desperate families first, opening his cabin to children and elderly neighbors who could not endure another night in cabins that had become death traps. His storm sash had created enough thermal efficiency to warm additional people without overwhelming his fuel supplies, proving that the system's benefits extended beyond simple comfort to actual life-saving capacity during extreme conditions. But teaching the technique required more than hospitality. Straub established a practical workshop in the settlement's largest barn, where men could learn the storm sash construction process under shelter while working with tools that functioned properly despite the cold. The barn provided workspace for measuring, cutting, and assembling frames while protecting glass panes from wind that could shatter them during installation. The field-expedient storm sash construction began with measuring each cabin's existing window casings to the exterior stop, ensuring tight fit that would prevent wind wash through gaps. Most windows in the settlement measured 14 inches by 20 inches, matching the standard rough. Openings that frontier carpenters used when glass was available in predictable sizes. Variations required individual attention, but the basic construction method remained consistent across all installations. Straub ran the operation like a mill production line, with each step handled by men whose skills matched the task requirements. The barn carpenter handled the precision work of cutting rails and stiles from available cottonwood and pine boards, maintaining the 7/8 inch thickness and 2-inch width that provided adequate strength without excessive weight. The joinery work used simple half-lap joints secured with wooden pegs, chosen for speed and reliability rather than decorative appearance. Glass installation required the most careful attention, as panes that cracked during construction could not be replaced until spring freight runs resumed. Each pane was set in linseed oil putty and secured with glazing points driven flush with the wood surface. The putty work had to cure enough to hold weather, but not so long that installation would be delayed while families waited for protection against the continuing cold. The mounting system used whatever hardware was available, from proper turn buttons salvaged from other projects to simple wooden cleats and finishing nails. 8 to 12 fastening points per sash provided adequate hold against prairie winds, with the critical requirement being tight contact between the storm sash and the exterior window casing to maintain the dead air space that made the system work. Straub emphasized one crucial frontier lesson that separated successful installations from failures, leaving a tiny drainage path at the bottom edge so moisture would not collect and rot the sill. A small gap, barely visible but carefully positioned, allowed any condensation to escape while maintaining the air seal that provided thermal benefits. The detail was simple, ungainly by Finnish carpentry standards, but absolutely essential for long-term durability in the wet-dry cycles of plains weather. The social reversal that accompanied the emergency construction work was complete and undeniable. The same men who had mocked the waste of extra glass now bartered their remaining supplies for window panes, trading labor and materials with the desperate intensity of people whose survival depended on immediate action. The storekeeper, who had questioned the economics of double glazing, found himself coordinating glass shipments and carpentry supplies as demand exceeded his available inventory. Men lined up for instruction and assistance, abandoning the territorial pride that normally governed frontier construction projects. The quick builder worked alongside the carpenter who had criticized his methods. Both men focused entirely on learning techniques that could save their families from another night of dangerous cold. Neighbors who had barely spoken during better times now collaborated on frame construction and glass installation, united by the immediate necessity of improving their thermal protection. The emergency workshop produced one storm sash every 2 to 3 hours, with 2 helpers working efficiently, fast enough to outfit multiple cabins each day while the extreme cold persisted. Standard glass panes measuring 8 inches by 10 inches or 10 inches by 12 inches proved easiest to work with, being readily available and simple to handle during installation. The air gap of approximately 1 inch was maintained through careful measurement and consistent installation methods, ensuring that each system would perform as intended. By the end of the week, as the Great Arctic outbreak finally began moderating, nearly every cabin in the settlement sported the storm sash installation that had seemed so foolish just days earlier. The overnight fuel requirements had dropped measurably in the converted cabins. Men reported needing 2 reloads between midnight and dawn instead of 3, a simple but meaningful improvement that stretched their remaining wood supplies through the remainder of the winter. Straub surveyed the transformed settlement with quiet satisfaction, watching smoke rise from chimneys that no longer worked desperately against impossible heat loss. The lesson had been taught by necessity and learned through direct experience, proving once again that on the frontier, results mattered more than conventional wisdom. Turns out you could not see better with 2 windows, but you could certainly live better. Straub's storm sash work was not just folk tinkering born from frontier necessity. His methodical approach to solving heat loss through double glazing represented exactly the kind of practical innovation that inventors across the country were formalizing and protecting through the patent system during the late 1800s. On February 18, 1890, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 423,567 to Frederick Straub of Surprise, Nebraska, for his improved storm sash design that had proven its worth during the previous year's Arctic outbreak. The patent documentation revealed the technical precision behind what neighbors had initially dismissed as wasteful excess. Straub's design specified the critical 1-inch air gap between panes, the mounting system using turn buttons and cleats for seasonal removal, and the drainage provision that prevented moisture accumulation and wood rot. The language was formal and exact, describing a secondary glazed frame positioned parallel to an exterior of the primary window sash, creating a sealed airspace for thermal insulation purposes. Within 5 years of the Great Arctic outbreak, storm windows had become standard practice throughout the cold regions of Nebraska and surrounding territories. The technique spread not through government recommendation or manufacturer promotion, but through the practical testimony of families who had survived brutal winters with measurably improved comfort and fuel efficiency. County agricultural agents began including storm sash construction in their winter preparation guidance, recognizing that thermal protection was as essential as adequate food storage for frontier survival. The evolution from emergency retrofit to accepted practice followed the familiar pattern of frontier innovation. What began as one man's unconventional solution to a specific problem became community knowledge, then regional standard practice, and eventually contributed to the broader understanding of building thermal performance that would shape construction methods for generations. The storm sash principle, trapping dead air between parallel glazed surfaces, would become the foundation for increasingly sophisticated approaches to window insulation. By the early 1900s, commercial manufacturers were producing factory-made storm windows designed for easier installation and improved weather sealing. The basic physics remained identical to Straub's frontier solution, but production methods allowed for better materials, more precise fit, and standardized mounting hardware. Seasonal storm windows became as common in cold climates as banking coals in a fireplace, representing established wisdom rather than experimental technique. The progression continued through the middle decades of the 20th century as building science developed more sophisticated understanding of heat transfer and thermal bridging. Researchers at universities and national laboratories began quantifying what frontier builders had learned through direct experience, that controlling air movement and creating thermal barriers at windows could dramatically improve both comfort and energy efficiency in cold weather construction. Modern confirmation of Straub's basic insight came through carefully controlled studies that measured the performance of storm window installations under laboratory conditions. Department of Energy testing demonstrated that adding storm windows to existing single-pane installations could raise interior glass surface temperatures by 20 degrees or more, reducing both heat loss and the radiant cold effect that made sitting near windows uncomfortable during winter weather. One documented case showed interior surface temperatures rising from 40 degrees to 60 degrees Fahrenheit when properly installed storms were added to a single-pane window during cold weather testing. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory research provided additional validation through field studies that measured the winter performance of various storm window combinations in occupied buildings. The studies confirmed that storm installations reduced heating loads measurably while improving occupant comfort through higher interior surface temperatures and reduced air infiltration around window frames. The data supported what frontier families had learned through necessity, that controlling heat loss at windows made the difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold. The technical understanding had evolved far beyond Straub's practical experimentation, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Dead air spaces slowed heat conduction. Tight installation prevented air movement that carried heat away. Proper drainage prevented moisture problems that could compromise long-term performance. These basic insights, learned through frontier trial and error, became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated window technologies that followed. Double-pane insulated glass units, developed during the mid-20th century, incorporated Straub's air gap principle into factory-sealed assemblies that eliminated the seasonal installation and removal required by traditional storm windows. The hermetically sealed units maintained precise air spaces and included desiccants to prevent interior fogging, but they functioned according to the same thermal principles that had made frontier storm sashes effective during the 1890s. Modern high-performance windows extended the concept further with triple glazing, low emissivity coatings, and inert gas fills that enhanced the insulating properties of the air spaces between panes. The technology had become sophisticated enough to achieve thermal performance levels that would have seemed impossible to frontier builders. Yet the basic approach remained recognizably similar to the double-glazing system that Straub had developed in his Nebraska workshop. Contemporary building preservation work acknowledged the continued relevance of storm window solutions for improving the performance of historic structures where full window replacement was not appropriate or desirable. Preservation specialists recognized that carefully designed storm installations could provide significant thermal improvements while maintaining the character and authenticity of older buildings, proving that frontier techniques retained practical value even in an era of advanced window technology. Energy efficiency programs in cold climates included storm window installation among their recommended retrofits for improving residential heating performance, acknowledging that the technique provided cost-effective thermal improvement for existing buildings. The program cited measured performance data showing substantial reductions in heating loads and improved comfort conditions, validating through modern measurement methods what Straub had proven through frontier necessity during the winter of 1899. The lesson had traveled from Nebraska prairie to national laboratory, from desperate improvisation to established building science, carrying the essential truth that Straub had discovered through calculation and confirmed through crisis. On the frontier, the man who planned for heat loss survived the night when planning stopped being optional, and his practical wisdom continued serving families more than a century. After the Great Arctic outbreak tested his storm sash against the honest judgment of Plains winter.